Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 199, Learning Judaism. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rothberg.
And next week, we're going to look back on this long series of Jewish education and try to make some meaning out of it, put some pieces together, along with our old friend B'nai Lappi. We thought it would be great to have the last formal interview in this series be with a Jewish educator who is working outside of the institutional context. Somebody who's out there pounding the pavement, educating people one person at a time to see what it looks like and how we might think about Jewish education completely outside the institutional context, where the only way that it can be successful is if people ask you to come and do it. So our guest today, Abby Eisenberg, is an independent Jewish educator. For many, many years, she was a middle school teacher in Bible and rabbinics at a Jewish day school, but she set off on her own and now, as we'll discuss in the podcast, has all kinds of contexts in which she teaches people individually, adults and children. In addition to being a teacher, Abby also bills herself as a Jewish life cycle officiant, and as she describes it, a core part of her work is creating and teaching individualized Judaics curricula for public and secular private school families, as well as creating and officiating at B'nai Mitzvah, or as we call them on this show, B-Mitzvahs. Abby regularly teaches adults in one-on-one sessions, as well as small living room experiences and at conferences. She also creates curricula for Jewish professionals as a kind of high-leverage approach that can be brought forward through those professionals to bringing that approach to education to other Jews. So we're excited to jump into this conversation with Abby, and perhaps we'll come out on the other end thinking about Jewish education a little bit differently. Abby Eisenberg, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
So tell us the story of how you became an itinerant Jewish educator.
So I call myself an independent Jewish educator. It's funny, I don't often think of myself as traveling around, but in fact, I do that. So I'll start way back in my family and in my childhood and what got me passionate about Jewish education and learning. I grew up in a modern Orthodox home. I usually describe it as a right-wing modern Orthodox home, and I got a lot of my commitment to Judaism and Jewish life from there. And I also had some incredible teachers at the small modern Orthodox day school that I went to. One of them, he passed away about 10 years ago. His name was Rabbi Eliezer Cohen, and he was just an iconoclast in Detroit. He stood for independent thinking and engagement with text, and I'll describe to you what it was like to be in his class. So boys and girls were separate from 7th grade on. So just imagine a bunch of 7th grade girls with desks around Rabbi Cohen's desk. And he would say at the beginning of the year, pick a Masechet, a tractate, a section of the Mishnah, the ancient rabbinic law on which really much of Jewish law is based. Pick a section of that. Here's the Jastrow dictionary, the dictionary of Talmudic terms, and go figure it out. Pick a Mishnah, a section, and figure it out. And he taught, I would say, the breadth that I covered over the years of high school, middle school and high school with him wasn't necessarily as much as the love that I learned for learning and for words and for Hebrew. You know, I'll say there's this video that's out there that somebody I don't know made after he passed away. And one of the things a young man in the video says is, I learned from Rabbi Cohen that I could figure out anything if I put my mind to it. And for better or for worse, I've inherited that. You know, I could sit for 3 hours diagramming out something and until I get it. And he stood for intellectual passion and a learning Judaism where people think and make independent choices. And I developed both a love of learning deeply and words, Jewish text and words, and also a love of breadth. And so fast forward a little bit into college, despite my love of learning, I stopped being observant pretty early on. I felt like I couldn't do it anymore. And I still felt a love of my culture and a love of Judaism, but I didn't want to be observant anymore. And so I haven't really been observant since for many years. And I went to Stern College, to part of Yeshiva University for undergrad, which was quite difficult since I was not observant at the time. And then I went to JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, for graduate school. Often people think of JTS as the conservative movement's flagship institution. Of course, there's some other flagship conservative movement institutions, but I went there for a master's in ancient Jewish studies. And that was my first experience in the world with Jews who were not Orthodox. At the time, what I think I was going through was I saw, wow, you can be so committed to Jewish life without being Orthodox. And you can be engaged in text and still look at it from a historical point of view. And things that often frustrated the rabbinical students, like, why aren't we looking at this from a more religious point of view? Those things didn't frustrate me because I loved looking at text from an academic perspective. And after, I was 24 or something like that, after I finished graduate school, and I really needed a break. I just was not ready. I couldn't. I thought, of course, I would end up in Jewish education and in the Jewish community, but I needed a break.
So help connect the dots for us. Once you took that break, I know eventually you came back into Jewish education. What did that look like? Where did you start out, and how did you get to this role that you have now?
I taught 6th and 7th grade Judaics at Schechter, Bergen County. And I loved having 75 quirky students. I loved teaching. But on the side, I found myself doing a lot of tutoring. And by my second year there, I found myself working with kids of all ages, different kinds of families. And I was creating a different curriculum for each child, ranging from, I think the oldest at the time was 9th grade and the youngest was 3rd grade. And I really fell in love with that because it was new. It was something different. Somebody literally said to me, a mentor said to me, why don't you go out on your own? And in about 10 seconds, I said, okay, I think I'm going to do that. I just thought if there are 4 families who want this, there must be more.
What were the families that you met at that time? What were they looking for? Why were they not sending their kids to a day school? Or I imagine they weren't sending their kids to a religious school either, and they were finding they wanted an independent teacher. So you loved it. What were they looking for? What were they getting out of that experience?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question because actually at the time, 3 out of 4 of the families were Orthodox affiliated. So one family was based in Riverdale, New York, and was, I would call them an open Orthodox family. I still work with them. And the kids are I think they're tuition free at the public school. And it's more financially feasible for them to send their kids to public school. And they are committed, open Orthodox Jews. And 2 of the other families, I think in Riverdale in particular, there are a few families that are very committed and part of, I would say, the open Orthodox community, meaning like the liberal end of the modern Orthodox community. And they send their kids to public school. They feel that they can give them either at home or with supplemental education what they're not getting in school. And for one of those families, I taught, she was a 4th grader at the time, or 5th grader, I actually can't recall. I taught her Mishnah, I taught her rabbinic texts. And the bottom line is, I think that financially, for many families, it's more feasible to send your kids to a public school. It's more financially feasible. And if you feel that you can offer a strong Jewish education in different ways, that's what you're doing for some families.
No, and that's interesting because I think it's important to point out for our listeners who might not know that if you're an Orthodox family, but you choose to send your kids to public school, there really isn't such a thing as an Orthodox after-school religious school. That the expectation in the Orthodox community is that everybody goes to day school. And so if for some reason you're in that situation, it was actually raising something that perhaps we'll talk about more later, but I was thinking about the expense of having a personalized educator. But if you're comparing that to a day school, it's actually much cheaper.
Yeah, I think the money questions, the affordability questions are really pivotal here because we don't always talk about how that makes a really important difference in the kinds of choices people make with Jewish education. So that's key. But I also just want to make the last connect the dots connection. I want to take us to the present. So given that that's your origin story with some of these Orthodox families, what does a week in the life or a day in the life or a month in the life of Abby Eisenberg look like now? What does your teaching look like? How is it carrying forward the thread that started with your initial tutoring work? And how is it different now? What's it look like?
It's quite different than at least in my first year. I work now, even though I was quite excited when I started about working with almost every age. And I found as I went along that I liked most working with fifth grade and up. And also I was, by last summer, I was working with just one of the moms of one of my students. She approached me and said, I want to do some learning on my own. Can you learn with me also? Can you tutor me also? So I discovered that I loved working with an adult, and I had taught adults in various ways in the past, but I decided that I wanted to do a little bit more of that. And so again, I just told people, like, this is what I'm interested in. And so now I have half kids and half adults. And I do a lot of living room learning sessions. So I just organize an event around a topic that I think people will be interested in. And, once or twice a month, although I think that's changing now and becoming more frequent, but once or twice a month, I'll create an Eventbrite, and it's a paid event, and people will come. And usually I get like between 10 and 15 people. That's what I'm most passionate about now. My week, so in the evenings, in the early evenings, I'm mostly with kids. Every child, because the way that I talk about my work, and I try and be true to this, is individualized Jewish education. Each child and each adult is learning something different. Sometimes the topics do overlap. And frankly, I would go insane if there was no overlap at all. So there is some overlap, but it's really the lens through which we look at a text, and the approach is very different for each child or adult.
Yeah, I'd love to just hear a little bit of the why there on the individualized education. So I think listeners to the podcast know this, but like both Dan and I in various capacities end up in various settings where we're facilitating participatory Jewish kinds of conversations of one kind or another. And the two of us were having a conversation, and I was talking about the sports and Judaism sessions that I lead. I go to different places. I've started talking about the intersection of sports and Judaism. The content is not the point here, but what I was getting at was I just recoil at the idea that I would sort of have my presentation that is sports and Judaism, and that I would just give it in the same form in every place. Because to me, it's like, if I'm in Boston, it's going to center the Red Sox and the Patriots. It would be stupid for me not to, because like when the people in that, not every person in that room, but like by and large, the shared context of people in that room is going to be Boston sports and not necessarily all of sports. There's like some subsection of people that are like diehard sports people. For those who aren't, talking about Boston's going to be the key. And then when I go to I was in Winnipeg. Like, first off, not only am I not talking about the Red Sox, I'm not talking about baseball, because Winnipeg doesn't care about baseball. So we talk about the Winnipeg Jets hockey team. And to me, it's like, I see people facilitate various programs and they have sort of their go-to. And it's not, and I know people that do that really well, by the way. I don't want to say that that's like a terrible modality entirely, but I think it's so important to think about how we can individualize by person, but even by community when it's more of the setting that I'm talking about, where you've got a whole room of folks. So tell me, like, what does it mean to individualize your work to every student, or at the very least to every, group of 10 people that you're interacting with?
Okay, so when I first meet a new student, I always, we have like an official consultation where we spend a lot of time talking about what that person wants to learn. So I have one very, very bright rising seventh grader who I worked with for the year last year. And she's so, her questions are so adult-like. I have a basic core curriculum, meaning I have basic texts that I want to explore with a child, let's say a middle schooler or high school, in their first year of our working together. So we did that, but we'd go off on tangents that were related to her interests in preparation for working on her Devar Torah for her bat mitzvah. And so she's decided that she wants to talk about chosenness, which is a very difficult topic in some ways. And I said to her, probably my answer is not your answer. Meaning I said to her, you probably know from my perspective, I think about how the Israelites probably they needed to see themselves as special in some way. And I looked at it more from a historical point of view. And she said, yeah, exactly. That's not what I want to talk about. Let's read the parts of the Torah that talk about that. And let's come up with religious reasons. And I want to then write my own reasons. So that is highly individualized, right? And then I have a rising ninth grader. We started out with some of the core texts. And then somehow, I don't even recall how, we landed on that he wants to really focus on understanding God. So let's look at texts through that lens, and texts that are specific to understanding God. So that's what we still do. And now we're shifting from Torah more so to the second part of the Hebrew Bible, to Nevi'im, to the prophets, to look at how God is represented in the prophets. With the adults that I work with, I'll give you a couple of examples. So Dan, the conference that we met at the wonderful educator Rebecca Milder's Jewish Enrichment Center in Chicago, I also met a Jewish education colleague who approached me afterwards and said, I want to deepen my own experience with text and text learning. And so we learn remotely now. And for her, she has a strong background. Many of the other adults I work with, it's generally of one form or another of intro. With this particular student, she knows the core narratives. And so we're delving a little deeper on, well, how do we understand this how do we understand this text in its ancient Near Eastern context? Might we understand it from a psychological point of view, from a literary point of view, from multiple points of view, and then also from a rabbinic point of view? Let's read a rabbinic commentary and see how the rabbinic commentary reinterprets the verse. And also, she wanted to work in particular on her biblical Hebrew. And so I'm working with her on that. So I would say, and this is a good example, she's a good example of overlap plus individualizing. One of the sessions that we had recently was on covenant. So we explored the 10 Dibrot, or the 10 Commandments. And we also explored some of the holiness code, which is in the middle of Leviticus, a bunch of kind of miscellaneous laws, let's just say. So I have taught that material and learned and explored that material with other students, but with her, the lens was different. It was looking at like the bigger theme of biblical law and covenant. So with this student, she wanted to kind of deepen her understanding of various ways to read a story, let's say, or a section, even though she already knows some of the basics. Well, how do we understand it really in a deeper way?
So I'm curious, when you describe some of that, I think about, Lex is the sports and Judaism guy. He's got his thing, and what he does is he's so committed that he changes it for the various cities that he goes to. We're going to Limud, UK, and I told Lex that he's got to bone up on the Tottenham Hotspur, and Manchester United and whatever.
We're doing the whole premiership. That's the plan.
Because he's got to really make it work for them. But when you've been describing what you do, I was struck by the range of it. I mean, it goes from studying a text or studying about a concept like chosenness to helping somebody sharpen their biblical Hebrew. I think about myself, if somebody wants to study some Jewish text, or if somebody wants to talk about the radical changes in the Jewish past, I could be their guy. But if somebody says, I want to sharpen my biblical Hebrew, I would probably say, I can read biblical Hebrew, but I'm not sure that I can help you read biblical Hebrew, so you probably should find someone else. How, as an individual teacher, do you think about And how do you gain the capacity to be kind of a generalist? And how do you know how to teach biblical Hebrew? Or is it something that perhaps people just shouldn't be as intimidated about? And when like it's often said, if you know Aleph and Bet, you can teach Aleph, and that maybe, we talk about the chutzpah to be a Jewish creative person. Maybe there's also a need for more people to have the chutzpah to be Jewish educators?
Yeah, I think so. Okay, so there's a range of ways that I would answer this. So first of all, I think, my biblical Hebrew in particular is strong enough where I can certainly help her. But you're asking a bigger picture question about the range of topics. So that is something that I struggle with because I have 16 students now, I believe, and those are the individual students, and with the adults mostly I meet with on alternative weeks. And look, I think I'll just say a little bit more about my own path, which is that despite my day school education and despite my master's in Jewish studies and my education at Stern College, part of what makes me, I hope, good at what I do is that I'm a learning Jew, and I believe in, lately I've been talking a lot about learning Judaism, like I don't belong to Orthodoxy, conservative, reform, whatever. I'm a learning Jew. Like we should have a new movement called Learning Judaism, which we could talk more about.
We've got a gerund. Dan talks about the gerund movement with reconstructing Judaism. So learning Judaism, like we've got gerunds already kosher in
Let's do it.
But it's interesting because Malka Fleischman at the Jewish Education Project wrote an article not too long ago in Tablet, which we'll share in our show notes. And it featured B'nai Lappi, who's one of our friends and frequent guests, as an example of somebody who, the way I read her article, which I thought was wonderful, was that she was presenting B'nai's approach to teaching as kind of a form of public learning. That's how I read it, that B'nai seems at the front of the room to be learning along with you. Now, clearly she knows a lot more than maybe she's letting on, but she certainly has this orientation towards being one of the learners. And the truth is, knowing her really well, she actually is learning all the time. And actually, that article helped me get a new sense of what Lex and I are doing on this podcast, which not too long ago, I wouldn't have necessarily categorized as education, but other people started to categorize what we're doing as education. And when I read that article, I kind of struck me that, we also are kind of these public learners, and that somehow in our learning, I don't think of it as education. I think of it as us learning, us doing research. But somehow in doing your learning and research publicly, that ends up having an effect on others of their learning, which basically means that you're a teacher. So it's an interesting, but like you say, maybe you're only a teacher within a certain movement that we might call learning Judaism. But I think it's very fascinating.
Yeah. So because I grew up religious, I think I speak the language of Jewish learning. Like it's easy for me in some ways to learn a verse from the Torah, or it's like part of me. So I have that base, and I certainly have other parts of my education that gave me some knowledge, but I built on what I don't know, and I'm comfortable doing that. And I do feel like I think it's actually better to call myself a learning facilitator. And for most teachers, I think most teachers should be learning facilitators, right? Because you're helping the other person's really. Once I read something about how the learner is the hero of the story or the center of, I don't know if it was at Rebecca's conference. But
sounds like it could have been.
Yeah, right? The learner's at the center of the narrative. And so I prepare enough so that I certainly feel like I prepare enough so that I'm confident and have a lot in my head, but so that I can help that learner learn. And again, I think because I'm so passionate about learning, I model that for other people. And I think that makes especially adults more comfortable.
So I'd love to dive into the adult. So you've talked about your work with adults. You've talked about your work a little bit with children. Mm-hmm. Most of the people as part of this education series specialize in one or the other of those. You, I think, have the ability to bring a lens of comparison between the two as somebody that's doing both very regularly that I think is really valuable. So I guess I'm curious to hear from you. In what ways is educating a room of children and educating a room of adults actually like the same or close to the same? What things might we think somehow are deeply distinct across age divides, but may really be similar? And on the other hand, what pieces might we not be thinking about that we sort of treat as universal that are actually pieces that are more true, say, in a room full of children than in a room full of adults, or vice versa?
I think oftentimes people are not comfortable with not knowing. And, even sometimes when I'm learning something in order to teach it, there are moments of discomfort. Like, why don't I know this already? Or why don't I know it faster? I think that's where the similarity is, that you find in a third grader, a fourth grader, a seventh grader, a ninth grader. They're sort of like, oh, should I know that already? Like, is my mind working the way it's supposed to? I think you find that across the board, and especially with adults who, I'll just give you an example of one of my students. And he got to me through a colleague, and he said, I know nothing. I don't know anything. I was raised extremely assimilated and secular, I think in France. And I said to him, I'm sure you know more than you think you know. He said to me during one of the sessions, he said, I'm sorry I'm asking so many questions. And I said, do I seem annoyed? Like, this is my job. So he said, I've been wanting to know, I'm asking so many questions because I've had these questions for 35 years. Now, I'm not sure if he's 35 or not, but I think that sense
he's 20
of
and that's what's most impressive.
I think that illustrates a little bit, people are, especially Jewishly, they feel like they should have known. Like, why don't they know exactly what to do on Rosh Hashanah, or why don't they know about the Passover Seder? And that certainly raises some systemic questions, but I think that's what they have in common. What they have, certainly there's so many pedagogic differences, and also within each population. Like, I think the range of pedagogical ability and the challenges for people, that varies across the ages. And students where there are challenges, it pushes me to be a better educator. That's a piece that I love.
Yeah, I want to carry forward this this insecurity people have. We've talked about it in a variety of contexts. We've actually talked about it in the internet context. We've talked about how a benefit of digital Judaism is that when you have those moments of uncertainty, of feeling boxed out in a conversation where you don't know something that you think, usually this is not true, but you think everybody in the room knows it and you're the only one who doesn't. The internet provides a way for you to quickly know it, or at least have some resources about it in a way that you can't ask a person in the room without feeling insecure and admitting to them that you didn't know it. So we've talked about it in that context, but I really want to highlight that people know more than they think. It's amazing to me how many people, I often find this comes up in the realm of Torah trope of all things. So the system of chanting Torah melodies. People are like, I'm so ashamed. I don't know how to chant Torah trope. I don't know how to chant from the Torah. And I'm like, well, first off, that's like among the most complex Jewish skills you can name. I mean, there's singing involved, which is hard for a lot of people. There's Hebrew involved, which is hard for a lot of people. There's memorization. Like, there's a lot of things that are actually deeply challenging about that, even for people that are really in Jewish learning. But second, there is a thing called Torah trope. Like, and you might even know that there's like some sort of families that the trope are organized into. The fact that that you feel ashamed that you don't know Torah trope, it exists. There are people out there that don't. And it reminds me of when I was studying for a test in middle school, when our class was preparing for a test. The teacher said to us, if you know what you don't know, you're good to go. If you can sort of list out the things that you're not sure about, okay, so you'll spend a couple hours studying, you'll get those, whether it's facts or conceptual, and then you'll be good to go. If you're sitting there and you actually don't know what you don't know, that's when you're in a little bit of trouble. And I find that there are a lot of Jews who know what they don't know, which is a kind of knowing. Can you expand a little bit more on this phenomenon of people feeling somehow that they don't know things when in all sorts of measurable ways, their life experience, their practices, it seems they do know a set of some things?
It's so interesting. Lex, your question made me think of a friend of mine who has taught himself a tremendous amount over the years. He's extremely well read. And he still thinks, like, he'll give a Devar Torah. I'll hear him give a mini sermon, a short lesson on, let's say, the Torah portion or another topic. And he'll still say afterwards in some conversation, I don't know anything, which is, to me, crazy. And I think that we have in our heads sometimes the people that know more or practice more, and we're comparing ourselves to those people rather than thinking about, like what you said, well, you already know what trope is, rather than thinking about what we do know. So another thought on this is, there's a part of the Torah that always moves me a lot. And you may be familiar with this, and your listeners also may be familiar with this. At the end of Deuteronomy, there's a well-known phrase in Hebrew. It's lo bashamayim hi. It's not in the heavens. The rabbis ran with that in a particular direction, but the words around that at the end of Deuteronomy are, the Torah is not out there in the ocean. It's not in the sky. It's reachable. You can reach it. I emphatically impart that message. Like, you might, and I think it's related to what you said, Lex, you might think you don't know something, you actually do, and you can get it if you want it. It's not unreachable. It's not unattainable. It's there for you. It's about finding ways, if you want, finding ways to figure it out.
It feels to me like in this story, you are like the family practitioner, the primary care doctor, who somebody just kind of shows up and they say, I don't know exactly what's going on here, and I wouldn't know what specialist to see if I wanted to, and I think in education, it often gets framed as intro. This is the 101. This is, and in that sense, not that there's anything wrong with that, but I think sometimes that can be said in a way and maybe perceived in a way that feels a little bit saying, oh yeah, that's the intro people, anyone can teach that. But no, actually what you're describing here is that it may be that in certain educational environments where it's clear what people are there to learn, and it's clear what the knowledge is, and the pedagogy has been clear for a long time, maybe in an environment like that, a graduate student can teach the intro class, right? And it's just kind of a basic. But when we think about pediatricians or general practitioners or family doctors, these are people with many, 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 many years of training, and they're not there to do something low. They're there to do something actually very significant, which is that they're the person who really understands and discerns and sits with you and understands who you are and what you need. And then down the road, maybe you graduate from them in a certain way, because now I really know, now I know, I've been studying for 3 years. I know I want to learn Jewish history. And then you go off to your graduate school or whatever it may be. And again, as I'm thinking about what we might need that's missing, I'm also thinking back to your own biography that you described. And I'm thinking here you grew up in an Orthodox environment. You described it as a right-of-center Orthodox environment, which we might generally think means it's one where they're just kind of telling you what it is and what to do, and it's very it's not very malleable. But you described some teachers who were the opposite of that, right? Who were people who said, I understand that the aim of education is somehow to unleash your own confidence and your own ability to do this on your own, and wherever it takes you, look, I might hope that it takes you in a certain direction, but I'm not going to teach you in a way that makes other directions not possible. And it feels like even in the liberal community, when we're talking about a lot of Jewish education happening in the denominational context, there seems to be often an agenda that says, there really is a right way to practice, and so we're going to restrict our teaching in a way that tries to maximize the chance that you're going to actually practice the way we want you to practice. And I think that generally these days that seems to be not successful, and it actually tends to result in people just leaving it altogether. So I'm kind of fascinated by what I sense us you describing here and us sort of grappling towards, which is a new framework for Jewish education that says that the early stages are about discernment, or about finding your passion. And I wonder how we could also deploy that system of Jewish education, since it would seem to be, at least as they think of it, counter to what a lot of the movements are trying to do. So maybe it only works in the independent sphere. Maybe it only works on the internet. So I wonder, I guess also, I wonder what you think of everything I've just said. I also wonder if ultimately the disruptive potential of what we're describing here. And I'm also wondering, what kind of pushback you've gotten, and perhaps what kind of pushback you should be getting from the organizations that might rightly be concerned that an approach like this to education could really flourish and really is what people need if they can only find out about it.
I do sense that sometimes congregational educators or rabbis, they don't approve of what I'm doing. No one says to me directly that aren't you taking away from congregations? And in fact, I'm not. The families that I work with right now and the adults that I work with, they don't belong anywhere except for the one Orthodox family that I mentioned earlier. But I do think, look, if you think about the Pew statistics, the Pew study, that it's something like 78% of Jews actually do say that they're Jews by religion. So people feel connected, right? At least the people that the Pew study interviewed, they feel connected in some ways. And yet only 19% said that Jewish law is what they adhere to. So we have, I think where we are in North American Jewish life is that people Jews, let's say, tend to feel connected, but they are not all, certainly they're not all affiliated, and they don't think that there are requirements. There aren't religious belief or practice requirements. So I think you're right on the mark. So what do you do with denominations that are saying, well, there is one right way? And I think rabbis my sense is like the rabbis that I know are smart enough to know that to nurture each individual's choice. But I do think, what would Jewish education look like if there were, let's say, what would supplemental Jewish education look like? Let's just take that for now. Look like if there were more systems for people to nurture their own passions rather than to hear there's this path to bar bat mitzvah. Instead, we're going to talk, we're going to ask you what you're interested in. What do you want to learn? And we're not going to end it at 12 or 13. We're going to make it a journey for, if that's possible, during childhood or from it's some kind of supplemental journey through the time that you're 18. Going back to your point about, a general practitioner. So once I was explaining to someone what I do, and she said, so you're like a Judaic psychologist. And I actually, she herself she's a psychologist. She's a CBT, a cognitive behavioral therapist. And she's wonderful to talk to. She's a really interesting person. And I said, you hit the nail on the head, because I think to go into a family's home or to meet with an adult, you really have to be able to listen, and your guidance depends on how much they need it, but you have to be able to suggest things and help them move along, but all with the goal of helping them nurture their own connection to Jewish study and Jewish exploration. And again, I keep coming back to this learning Judaism piece. And I'll say, once I had a professor in graduate school, and I think he said it was something like the cat's out of the bag. Like some people don't believe in God. Some people, they're not going to be observant. What do we do with that population? Why do we keep trying to get people to do things a certain way? It doesn't work anymore. How do we individualize Jewish learning and Jewish exploration to instill, what if we used Jewish learning and exploration to instill passion about everything in life? Like, you should do everything with passion. Find the thing in Judaism that you're passionate about or curious about, and then, well, what else are you passionate about? Is it medicine? Is it law? Or not? Maybe you're passionate only about, but I think what you're saying is, how do we individualize more? And I don't know. I mean, I could try and guess, but I wish there were more systems in place to help people nurture their own Jewish passions and their own connections to study and exploration.
So I'm going to try and close with a two-parter. The two parts of this question feel related to each other in my head. I can't quite articulate exactly how, so I'll trust you to do some of that work, or, they'll float a little discombobulated, and that's okay. That's, Judaism Unbound, Judaism Uncombobulated. Okay, first part. I'm really refreshed by the ways in which this conversation implicitly, under the surface, I feel like no condescension towards students. I feel like sometimes in Jewish education, and it's not just Jewish education, in education generally, we talk about students as these really primitive kinds of creatures that aren't able to wrestle with complexity, that have to be sort of spoon-fed certain things, and you're really not doing that. You really are placing a lot of trust in students that wherever their interests are, wherever they're called, you're going to follow that direction with them, and you're not going to dictate it beforehand. And that's awesome. And so I want to name that, and I want to say that I hope that that can be a model for other kinds of Jewish educational settings. And the second piece is related to that I do think it's related. This is where we're trying to combobulate. It feels like this is a lot of work, the individualization that you talk about, following a student's interests, trusting them in that direction, and, making extra lesson plans. I mean, you spoke about how some of your work overlaps. You can teach some of the same material in multiple settings, but a lot of it is just for one solitary student. So I guess what I'd ask on that front is, why is it worth it? Why is all of the time that goes into every individual student that you work with, why is that something that you should spend your time doing? Why is it something that others should see as worth their effort?
I think it's worth it because, again, going back to what we were just talking about, I think in the end, if we nurture each child or adult's individual interests and we help them learn in ways that are interesting and stimulating and challenging and that work for them pedagogically, we're in the end creating more engaged Jews. If we tell them, and that's important to me, I mean, for better or for worse, I care about people, Jews, or people being engaged in Jewish ways. Like that's important to me. And I also am committed to the idea that that's not the same for everyone. It's not the same for everyone. And what you said about how we sometimes dumb down, I think the reason we do that sometimes is it's hard to teach, and it's hard to master material and think about how to present it or how to help another human explore it. So I think it starts with us. It starts with the teachers, and it starts with those of us that are thinking about those of us who are providers of Jewish education. How do we share, if we're passionate about Jewish study or Jewish life and we think there's something positive there, how do we share that with others? And that's actually a lot of responsibility. And if we do it in ways that aren't meaningful, or we convey that there is one right way. And again, and I'm not talking about, sometimes when you talk about pluralism, you can also think about, what about extremes? Are you teaching someone that it's okay to murder? No, of course not, right? We're talking about there isn't one right way within a relatively normal set of behaviors. So do we think of ourselves as learners and creators and facilitators? And are we proud of our own connections to Jewish life and Jewish study? And can we impart that to other people? And especially with study, can we, Jewish educators, those of us that consider ourselves providers, can we approach what we do with rigor and nurture someone else's learning so that in the end, they're more engaged and they learn, right? A lot of people walk away from Judaism at 12 or 13 thinking this is, and this is something people have been talking about for 25 years. They walk around with a third grade Judaism. So how do we, right? How do we teach in a way that says, no, this is actually rich with meaning and there are multiple layers and it's intellectually stimulating, and that carries over into your own life.
Thank you so much, Abby Eisenberg, for joining us. It's been a great conversation. Thank
you so much for inviting me on.
And thanks, of course, to all of you out there listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. As a reminder, this is our second to last episode in our big old unit on Jewish education that we've been doing for a number of weeks now. We encourage you to go back and listen to some of our previous episodes. There are a lot of really, really great guests. And we also hope that you will join us next week for our concluding episode of this series, which will feature B'nai Lappi, one of our longtime friends of the podcast and a returning guest, a multi-time returning guest. So we hope that you'll join us for that. But as we close this episode out, we want to encourage you to be in touch with us, as we always try to do at the end of these episodes. And there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to our Twitter feed at @JudaismUnbound. Third, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, you can hit us up via email, Dan@JudaismUnbound.com or Lex@JudaismUnbound.com. Use them both, use one or the other, whatever speaks to you. The last request we like to make is that we really deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you can send our way. And you can do that at JudaismUnbound.com/donate with either a monthly recurring gift or a one-time donation. So thanks so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.